Okay, cool. I think I've got everything situated yet this morning. I've moved a couple of things around and reassembled a couple of things, so I'm still trying to get everything set up. But I think this is good. I think I like where my mic is. I think I need a different mic stand, but that's a different conversation. So yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Christopher Harrison. I'm gonna fix my camera switch here. There we go. Yeah, my name is Christopher Harrison. Welcome to Code and Coffee, the show where we get in and explore different aspects of web development by actually getting in and creating an application. Now, I'm going to say good morning to everybody in chat in just a couple of moments here. But what I do want to highlight is the fact that this really is Christopher coding here. So I'm a senior program manager inside of Microsoft. I've been doing web dev for quite a while now. And this show is all about, well, web dev, but it's really all about the developer experience. It's all about getting in and playing with things. So everything that we're going to be building here, we're going to be building live. That I don't actually have any pre-canned demos or anything like that. That everything that you're about to see, we're going to do for real here. That I'm going to actually write the code, we'll pull up documentation, and we're going to go in and we're going to explore. And so as part of that, one of the big things that you're going to notice is I'm going to wind up making mistakes, that things won't necessarily work exactly the way that we were hoping they would, etc. And that's really part of what this is all about. The other big part that this is all about is you, chat, the audience. So ask questions as we go. If you're not sure about something, if you want to make suggestions, anything like that, please do go ahead and say all of that. Like, you know, this is very much about as much about you as it is about me. So please do say hi, ask questions, interact. This is what this is all about. So with this, good morning to Victor, good morning to Ankit, good morning to Paul, good morning to Anand. It is fantastic to see you all here. So yeah, so great. So it looks like everything is moving well. Good morning to Dan. Good to see you back. And good morning to Mohammed. Waiting for people to just check in here. I'm just going to get a sip of coffee. There we go. Always a good thing. Cool. All right. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what it is that we've got going on and what I want to do to update my my application and do a couple of things here. So yeah, hello to Alberto, hello to Andres. It looks like we've got a much bigger lag than usual today, which is a little disconcerting, but hopefully it doesn't go sideways. My contact is bothering me. I hope that stays okay. Sorry, I'm having a contact issue here. There we go. Okay, I think that's good. Yeah. Anyway, good morning to Jake. Good morning to Ruchi. Good morning to Aviva. Or good evening, I guess. Yeah. Good morning to Derek. Always good to see everybody showing up. That's always fun. I really need to get an OBS plugin to like show chat when I'm on full screen. I'll need to get that set up at some point. Hello to Zaya. Hello from Stockholm. Hello to Julian. Hello. So yeah, cool. All right, let's go ahead and hello to Artyom. Hello to Sashi. I've got everybody checking in. I love it. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at what it is that we're hoping to do and the current state of our project and everything else. So last week, and I know Mallory is out there. Mallory, if you want to do me a huge favor and throw in the link to last week's video. Last week, what we did is we started a React project. And we're doing this project with TypeScript, and we're also using a little thing called Snowpack as well. Now, if you're not overly familiar with TypeScript, if you're not overly familiar with React, if you're not overly familiar with Snowpack, that's okay. And on top of all of that, if you missed all of that last week, if you weren't here for any of that, that's also, again, actually just fine, because the hope here is that we'll go in and we'll explore, and you can sort of just like see what's going on, that you can learn little concepts that hopefully this will inspire you to dig in and start creating your own projects as well. That's what this is all about. So that's what we want to focus in on is really just that exploration and on that learning experience here. So this is our GitHub repository, and I'll go ahead and paste that into chat there. So that is that's available to you, and you can go ahead and grab that repository and clone that and so forth. And what I want you to notice is right now we have one source folder, and everything that we're using is inside of this source folder right now. So we've got our couple little files and so forth. And I'm going to get into these files here in just a moment to talk about what it is that they're doing, and also to talk about how bundling works as well here, because last week, if you happen to be here last week, we had a little bit of an issue with the bundler. And so I want to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about how bundlers work and how to properly have set all of this up. I want to spend a little bit of time going back in and restructuring that, which will also hopefully be a good exploration into bundlers as well, because you really can't do anything web dev related these days without using a bundler. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that because I think it's an important topic. And so we'll get in and we'll explore what's going on here, and we'll explore also as part of this what Snowpack is doing for us, which is going to be our bundler. Then what I want to do is I want to add some interactivity to our application. That right now, the way that our application sits here, give me just a second. Let me launch this. There we go. So this is our basic application. So right now I've got a little recipe manager. Right now I've got a couple little items here of chicken gumbo, pork stir fry, roast turkey, baby back ribs. I've got those little items right now, and I want to try and start to make things a little bit more interactive. And I'll start with something maybe a little bit basic of just like allowing us to click on an item and toggle something, and then we'll start to continue to build from there. So we'll have a little bit of work that we'll need to do in that space. But that'll be the big thing that I want to focus in on is how we can update our objects, how we can work a little bit with state, and how we can work with events inside of React. So that's going to be the direction that we're going to wind up going here. So yeah, cool. So that's that. I need to do one real quick thing here. So bear with me for 1 second. I might disconnect for 1 second. Hold on. I need to make one quick change. Give me 1 second. There we go. Okay, now I'm back. I knew that was gonna flip. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. So and a real quick good morning to Sambo, Andy, and Todd, and to Yao. Yeah. Cool. All right, let's get back to it. Okay, so here's our app. Here is our project, and let's talk a little bit about bundlers. So one of the biggest things that we've seen in quote unquote recent years, and by recent years I'm going to say about the last 10 years or so, which I know is a lifetime in the internet, but in the last 10 years, maybe shorter, maybe about the last 8 years or so, is the introduction of more and more and more frameworks. And the reason for this is because the web has become a more mature place, and web developers have become more mature. Well, mostly more mature, I guess. And by that, what I mean is we've started to figure out what we need to do. We've started to assemble the tooling that we need to be more productive as web developers. That if you think about something like Windows development, which has been around for a very, 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 very long time, decades and decades, that even going back into like the days of, say, VB6, that we had a lot of great powerful tools back then, that we had these WYSIWYG editors where we were able to drag items out onto the screen and create really robust applications, even if they weren't necessarily the best looking applications. They were extremely robust, and there was a lot of great tools that were available. And we're now starting to see a lot of that come into the web dev space as well, that we're starting to see a lot of great frameworks and a lot of great tooling. Now, unfortunately, one of the biggest hurdles, one of the biggest obstacles that needs to be overcome in this space is the fact that a lot of what we're trying to do, the web wasn't really designed for. That HTML, CSS, and especially JavaScript were not necessarily designed for what we're trying to get them to do in today's day and age. That as a lot of people might know, or maybe you don't know, that JavaScript was written in a relatively short number of days. Like I want to say it was like written over a weekend, or maybe a little bit longer than that. That was when a programming language, what's now become one of the most popular programming languages in the world, was written. And it was written in a specific time, and it was written for a specific purpose. And so what we're using it for today, it wasn't necessarily designed for. And it certainly has improved over time, that there's been a lot of new features that have been added in. But unfortunately, it's still not necessarily built for everything that we need it to be built to do. And this becomes a little bit of a hindrance when we start talking about different frameworks, because now we're having to overcome some of the shortcomings of the language, and we're having to overcome some of the shortcomings of CSS and HTML. And in order to do that, what the framework developers have started to rely on is some bit of a middle component known as a bundler that can take whatever it is that we're creating and generate the appropriate HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so what this does is it creates a really nice abstraction. So I'm able to write using the tooling that I want to be able to write, and it basically then compiles, if you will, down into something that can then be understood by the browser. And if you think about this, this is something that we've been doing for our entire lives, that chances are nobody that's listening here has ever written anything with assembly. Well, hopefully you haven't. But yet we've all written applications that have run. And the reason that we've all written applications that have run is because something happened in between my writing the code and it executing, so that there was some compiler or there was some interpreter or there was something else that was generating a new copy of my application in a language that could be understood by the computer to then go ahead and run. So this concept is not new. And in web space, this is going to be handled by a bundler. Now, the catch that we wind up having here is, unlike, say, writing C# or unlike writing, say, Java. Let's take Java as an example. Unlike writing Java, which is always going to get compiled down into bytecode, and there's really one organization that runs Java, in the web space, we have a myriad of frameworks that are available to us. And we have different CSS frameworks, we have different programming frameworks, we have, a lot of different tools that are available to us. And on top of that, we have different ways that we can use all of these different tools and different combinations of all of those. And so, unlike using something like Java, where we can just have something that's going to compile that into bytecode and then we're done, when we're talking about web dev, we need something that's going to be a little bit more flexible, because again, we could be doing all sorts of different things here. And so this is why bundlers can sometimes be a little bit more complex to then work with, because of all the different options that are available, because of all the different things that are available to us, because of, well, the complexity sometimes of doing web development. Now, I have this basic philosophy that I don't necessarily want to write code to generate my code. And this is where something like Webpack, is not necessarily my favorite tool. Now, I'm not bashing Webpack. Webpack is by far the most popular bundling tool that's out there. The challenge that I have with Webpack is having to write this bit of code here. Let me bring this up on my screen. There we go. Having to write this bit of code to then generate the output on the other side. That's really where I struggle. And so this is why I like to use tools like Parcel or Snowpack, which will handle that for us. So this is why we have bundlers. This is the need for having a bundler. And this is the one that I use. And I'm going to go take a look at what Snowpack is doing for us here in just a moment, and then we'll restructure our project to work with it. But Anand asked this fantastic question, which is, will TypeScript take over regular JavaScript? And my answer to that is no. And honestly, it's not necessarily designed to. It's a great question, but it's not necessarily designed to. So for anybody who's not familiar with TypeScript, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. And what TypeScript was initially built to do was to, again, help overcome those shortcomings of JavaScript, and really to bring in the functionality that JavaScript didn't necessarily offer that a lot of other programming languages did. And the other big thing that TypeScript does for us is it allows us to indicate the data types of items. So we get a static typing system, which eliminates an entire class of bug and really just makes you a more efficient and effective developer. Now, over time, as JavaScript has matured, as ECMAScript has matured, some of the functionality that was exclusive to something like TypeScript has actually now become part of JavaScript. And so what I really see continuing to happen is JavaScript and ECMAScript just continuing to mature. So I don't ever see a scenario in which TypeScript will ever take over regular JavaScript. And again, I really don't think that it's necessarily geared to do that. That TypeScript is really there to give me a consistent programming language, so that way as JavaScript and ECMAScript are doing their thing, I know that I can always write this, and then I can eventually emit the version of JavaScript that I want, eventually emit the version of JavaScript that I need. So that's really where TypeScript sits. So I don't think that TypeScript will ever overtake JavaScript. I don't think it's necessarily designed to do that. Okay. So let's come back over here to our code, and let's take a look at what we've got here. Okay, so I'm gonna delete this build folder here. Can I give another example of real-time bundling? You mean not in the web environment? I mean, like outside of the web environment, like almost anything that we do, programming wise, we'll do some form of bundling. We'll do some form of taking whatever it is that we've built and putting it together into a format that can be understood by our application. So if you've done anything with .NET, if you fire up, Visual Studio and you do Control-Shift-B, which is going to compile all of your code and bring all of your components together into an executable, that's bundling. If you're creating a wheel file inside of Python, that's bundling, that you're taking your various Py files and putting them into something that can then be shared out. If you're creating a jar file in Java, that's bundling. So almost anything that you do where you're writing code and it's being converted into something else that can be understood, that's bundling. So that was Sasha's question about another real-time example of bundling. Hopefully that answers that question for you. So, okay, let me close all this. Okay. So let's take a real quick look here at our project structure here. Let's talk a little bit about what we've got. So what we've got here is we've got an index. Sashi, if that didn't answer your question, please ask it again. Let me know, and I'll give another run at it. So if that didn't answer it for you, please do let me know. Okay. So here's my core index file. So this is where our application is going to start. This is where the entry point is going to be. This is what everybody's going to wind up seeing. And what you're going to notice right here is this is where we're going to pull in our JavaScript. And what I want you to notice is the JavaScript file that we're looking for is index.js, which is pretty conventional, that the name of that index, or the name of that JavaScript file that your application is going to start with, is going to be index.js. This is pretty typical. So that's what we've got as our entry point. But if you take a look over in our folder structure here, you're going to notice that index.js doesn't exist. This is what our bundler is going to do for us. It's going to convert whatever it is that we've got here into the appropriate file structure so that it could be understood. Now, in particular, what it's going to do is it's going to convert my index.tsx into that index.js file. Now, index.tsx, this is using the TypeScript version of JSX. And JSX is the combination of JavaScript and HTML, XML that React is famous for. And what it allows you to do is to intermingle your code and your HTML. But again, my browser isn't able to understand this. Remember that my browser is built to understand JavaScript. So I need something that's going to convert that into the appropriate JavaScript. And so that's what we're going to have happen here. This is what my bundler is going to do, is it's going to convert that into the appropriate JavaScript. That's what we want to see. Now, what you're also going to notice is that we're going to import in another file here. We're going to import in our app file here. And so this will need to get converted into JavaScript. And then over here is our recipe list. This will also need to get converted into JavaScript. So all of this needs to get converted into JavaScript. That again, my browser is not able to run these TSX files. It needs that JavaScript. The tool that I'm using to do that is, again, Snowpack. So Snowpack is an auto bundler, and what it will do is it will look at your project and it will, for the most part, figure out what needs to be done. Now, you can go in and configure different things inside of here, and there are certain times where you need to configure certain things to work properly. But what's great is when we look at a lot of the popular frameworks, they're going to have a relatively consistent structure. That if I'm using JavaScript and core JSX files, then I'm going to have the extension of .jsx. So Snowpack is built to go, oh, it's a JSX file. I know what to do with this. Or if in my case, I'm using TypeScript, and it's going to have an extension of TSX, Snowpack is going to go, oh, it's a TSX file. I know what to do with this. And so when I run my build command here, let me bring up a new window. And I just have this as an npm script. So let me just npm run build. What you're going to notice is that it now puts together this brand new build folder. And so you'll notice that it's now generated the JavaScript for my index.js. It generated the JavaScript for my app.tsx. It generated the JavaScript for my recipe.tsx. So Snowpack did all of this for me. It generated all of those files for me. Now the question is, how did it know to put those files there? How did it know to look inside of source? We've already talked about the fact that it's just going to look for TSX and automatically know what to do with that. How did it know to go put everything inside of build? How did it know to look inside of SRC? Well, the reason that it looked inside of SRC is because I set up a Snowpack config.js file, and you can go check the docs for how you can go in and configure this. The main option that I set up here is my mount. So this is where it's going to go look. And so what I'm saying is go look inside of source and then output that to the root directory of wherever you put the built files. And so my built files are going to be inside of a folder called build that's just hard-coded into Snowpack. So it's going to take everything from source, put that into here, and now we've got everything inside of one directory. And so this is where we left our project last week. Now, what I really want to do here is I want to update this. I want to make this into the folder structure that typically you would wind up using when creating a project. That normally when you're creating a project, let me launch Zoom it here. Give me 1 second here. Talk amongst yourselves. I will give you a topic. The Industrial Revolution was neither industrial nor a revolution. Discuss. Okay, cool. So normally the way that you wind up building things is you have two folders. You've got one folder called public, and then you've got one folder called SRC. And my public folder, this would contain all of the HTML, CSS, and maybe some core JavaScript files. Basically anything that's static, anything that's not going to change, that would go into my public folder. And my src folder, this would be all of my TSX files, all of my JSX files, all of my JavaScript files that need to have something happen to them to make them function correctly. Or in other words, the stuff that actually needs the bundler to execute. So this is typically the way that our project structure should look. And normally the way that you would build this out then is normally the way that you would build this out then is you would go ahead and set up the location of your public as public and have that emit to the root. And then whatever it is that's going to be bundled or have something executed on it would be inside of src, and that would then be emit to a folder called dist or distribution or something like that, or maybe scripts or whatever it is that you would want to call it. I personally like dist. So this is normally the way that things would be output. So public goes into the root of everything, and then our TSX files and everything else is going to be emit into our dist folder. So let me build that folder structure here real quick. Dr. Guthels, Dr. Sarah mentioned never typed on Zoom It. Hit T. And that will type on Zoom It. I really should record like a 5-minute video on Zoom It. Zoom It is my favorite presenting tool. There's so much that you can do with it. So yeah, you can type. You can change the colors. You can draw different shapes with it. And I think that there's a what is it? I swear that there's a circle option as well, I think. But anyway, yeah, you can go in and just you can do a lot of cool things with it. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of Zoom It. Okay, tangent aside there. Let's set this up correctly. So let me create a folder called public. Let me move my index.html into there, move, and then let me, I don't know why you're in two places, but that's all right. And let me update this now to eventually go look at dist whack index.js, because remember, that's where all of our stuff is going to wind up going, that we're telling our anything in source to go into dist. So that's where that index.js is going to wind up looking. So Sasha asked the question, npm will run that build folder or source folder? Great question. Okay. So package.json. What you're going to notice is I set up 2 scripts inside of package.json for Snowpack. So the 2 scripts that I have are build and start, although I clicked on them in opposite order. Start will start my local dev server, and so that will then run locally and do all of that good stuff for me. My build will then be inside, or my build will then run Snowpack build. And so those are the 2 different Snowpack commands. Yeah, there we go. That that you can go ahead and run. You can actually see them documented right here. So Snowpack div and then Snowpack build will then go ahead and do all of that. So it's not npm that's running that directly, but rather it's the 2 scripts that I registered inside of there. So one for dev and then one for build. So that is what's making my my magic happen. You may notice as I go through this that I'm potentially putting in a little bit more pauses, that I sadly watched myself present the other day. I was like going back and cutting some videos that I had done up. And one of the things that I noticed is I I generally do a pretty good job of avoiding saying I'm not great at all at it, but it's something that I've tried to make a much more mental effort at avoiding. So just trying to pause instead of saying It's tough, but apparently one of the big crutches that I have in my delivery speech is I keep using the word so or so now as my rejoinder, as my connection to whatever it is that I'm about to say next. And after watching it for like 5 minutes, I got so annoyed listening to myself that I was like, how in the world is anybody else listening to me? As a result, I'm trying very hard to avoid saying the word so and so now. So there you go. If you notice that I'm just being quiet a little bit more often, that's why. That's Christopher trying to avoid saying the word so or so now to move to whatever next little topic it is. Okay. Little aside there. There's my updated my dist. Let's go ahead and run my build. npm run build. Let's see the output here. On my new output, Alberto says you're constantly using basically. Yeah, it's funny. We all have those little crutches. Yeah, it's tough. It's really tough to get away from it. Okay, with that update now made, now take a look at my folder structure. Let me zoom in just a little bit here to hopefully make this a little bit easier to see. Yeah, there we go. So there's my build folder here. I guess I'm zoomed in one level too much. There's my build folder here. And what you're going to notice at the root of that build is index.html. And then inside of my dist folder, now I've got my app.js, my index.js, and my recipe list. So it now generated all of those files for me. And if I go back to my project here, my project should still be running just fine. We brought that up a little bit ago. Oh, apparently I stopped it. Or I did something to it. It might have crashed out. Yeah, it crashed out when I started moving things around. It didn't like that. Let me rerun that. There we go. Cool. Perfect. Okay, yeah. So now, there you go. You'll notice the update to the page here. So it does, in fact, still work now that I've moved everything around there. So Paul says, please don't beat yourself up about saying so. It's the content that matters. Thank you. I appreciate that, Paul. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So you'll notice that it generated everything inside of my dist folder. Now, the other big thing that I want to highlight is it also generated this little snowpack folder. And the snowpack folder is important because it's also going to contain everything that I need to run React. So you'll notice that it's got my React.js, and you'll notice that it's got my React DOM.js. And so those two files are going to be the two files that will make all of the magic happen for React. So those are going to be required as well, and it automatically puts those inside of a folder called _snowpack. The TLDR on all of this, the too long didn't read on all of this, is that build folder there, that now becomes the sole folder that I need to deploy out when I go to push this out to production. All that I need is just that build folder, and that's it. Now, for those of you who might have been tuned in last week, you might have noticed that I struggled a little bit trying to get Azure static web apps set up and configured correctly. And I have this mantra. If the tool that you're trying to use, in the way that you're trying to use it, feels too difficult, chances are you're using the tool incorrectly. Or to put this another way, and this is a trap that we all fall into, is 99 out of 100 times, it's our mistake, not the tool's mistake, not the framework's mistake, not the application's mistake when we're writing code. It's almost always that we've done something wrong. And when you start doing debugging, and especially when you're under pressure, you sometimes forget that rule. And it's an important rule, and it's one that you really should try and remember. And when I set up my static web app here, let me actually just create a new one real quick, just so we can see the screen that I'm talking about. Static web app. And hit create. And I'm just going to create a real quick new Wibble. Wibble. I don't really care what the name is. I just want to get to one screen here. And let me sign in and continue. Whoops. There we go. And now I'm on the right screen. Okay. You didn't miss anything. Okay. So all I did was I went into Azure, and I'm just creating a new static web app. So didn't really do anything there. So down here, what this is eventually going to do is this is eventually going to ask me for the folders that contain everything that I want to push out. So if you're not familiar with Azure Static Web Apps, Azure Static Web Apps is a fantastic service that will host your application, give you serverless code through functions, and do a lot of other really cool things. It's a wonderful service. But what it needs to know is a couple of very important pieces of information. It needs to know the root of your application, which is typically just going to be /. It needs to know the location of any Azure functions that you're going to run, any serverless code. That's typically going to be API. And then it also needs to know the output location of your static files. And so that would be all of your HTML, your CSS, and your JavaScript. And if I come back over here, that's my build folder. That's really what this is asking for, is it's asking me, in my case, where's this build folder? So that's all that I need to type in here, is just simply build. And now this will work correctly. Now, what's really cool, or one of many things that's really cool about Azure Static Web Apps, is that you'll notice that it's based on GitHub. So I'm connected out to a repository that I have. I'm specifying a branch. So this is where it's going to look for all of my code. And in particular, what it's going to do inside of here, if I go back to the root, is it's going to create a workflow. It's going to create a GitHub action here. And so if I want to go in and modify anything in here, I can actually do that by just modifying this action that it created. So it's this great integration here that it very much meets me as a developer where I'm at. I'm already using GitHub. It meets me right there. So I needed to just look inside of that build folder, and it will find everything that it needs. So I went through a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth last week, and it was all because in the end, I didn't understand my tool. that I didn't understand what it was that Snowpack was doing for me. And so that's why I wanted to spend a little bit of time this morning, or I guess a fair bit of time this morning, talking a little bit about bundlers, talking a little bit about Snowpack, and talking about what the tool is doing for us. Because we need to understand our tooling, we need to understand what it is that we're using in order for us to properly use it. So that's where things wound up going sideways. Okay, real quick sip of coffee there. And I'm going to pause here for just a moment because that's my update bundling. So I can put a little check next to that. Sound effects help. There we go. Okay, perfect. So that's our first check. And if there are any questions, please feel free to type them in. I know that there's a bit of a delay. Yeah. I'm going to readjust here. Okay. Let's turn our attention then to React. Now, one of the things that React has a little bit of a use a sip of coffee to avoid so. That's a great idea. I like that. I like that. Thank you, Eugene. One of the things that we talked about last week when we introduced React is the fact that React has a little bit of a reputation for being complex. And I think part of that is potentially well-deserved. And I should always be clear here that I'm offering up my own opinion, and I'm in no way, shape, or form bashing React. That I've been able to use React for a little while now, and I actually kind of like it, that I now get the setup and I can see the appeal of it. Admittedly, it took me a little bit to get to there, but I can actually see it. So whenever I'm saying something, potentially negative, I'm not bashing it. Don't at me. Don't, oh my gosh, Microsoft hates React. That's not at all the case. But again, React does have that little bit of a reputation. And there's a couple of different reasons for that, the biggest of which is how it manages state. The biggest rule, actually, let me define a term here. State is whatever information your application needs to be able to manage throughout the life cycle of that application. And so state would include maybe the particular mode that your application is in. So if you're allowing somebody to edit something, then I would have a flag somewhere in state saying that we're now in an edit mode. It would include any information that my user is going to be interacting with. So if I'm displaying, for example, a list of recipes, then part of my state would be that list of recipes. If I am allowing somebody to edit that, then part of my code is then going to be allowing my user to then modify that information to update that state. And so that is what state is. The big rule about state in React is state is immutable. Immutable is a fancy way of saying that it's not allowed to be changed. Now, I know that might sound a little bit funny. You're like, wait a minute, Christopher. If somebody's going to be editing values, state is absolutely going to change. What do you mean it can't change? What I mean when I say that it's immutable, what I mean when I say that you can't change it, what I'm actually saying is if I need to update values, what I need to do is replace them with new copies of the value. There's a very important reason for this, that one of the biggest things that React wants to do, it's part of what makes React so performant, is it only wants to update what needs to be updated on the user interface. So in other words, it only wants to update what's changed. And the most efficient way for it to do that is to know what the original object was, what the original values were, and then what it is that I now want to update them with. And then what it can do is it can do a comparison between them. It can go, oh, okay, this changed, and this changed. Let's go update the UX for just that and not do anything else. On top of that, it will, on top of that, it also helps to eliminate an entire class of bugs. That one of the other things that can come up if you're modifying values is you can sometimes wind up in an inconsistent state. And this is especially true if maybe what I need to do is update two values, maybe on the same object. And so what I do is I update this value and then I update this value. Well, after I update this value, and before I get down to that second one, my object is in a potentially invalid state. And on top of that, React doesn't necessarily know then that I might need to go back and update another property, another value, and another something else. So it becomes very tricky then in those types of scenarios. And so the safer thing to do is basically just give me a whole new copy of the object that's in the exact state that you want it to be in once you're done editing, and then I'll go in and look at it. So Sashi then asks a great question here, which is, you mentioned it creates copies. It creates a new copy every time the state is rendered. Okay, that's a great question. One of the big things that you can do in React is you can control the state, that you can control actually like how many state objects you have, and you can really get a lot of control over what it is that's going to be what's going to be your unit of change. So you don't necessarily need a huge state object, that I can have a lot of smaller ones depending on whether or not my application can support that, and help sort of mitigate things that way. But the other thing is this, and everything, of course, has a trade-off. So the trade-off here is that my garbage collector, my cleanup, might just have to run a little bit more frequently in order to support that. And honestly, that's fine. That my browser is going to be able to handle that for me pretty well. The better performance is going to come by limiting the amount of UX updates that I have to do there. So that's going to be the trade-off, and that's why that is set up that way. So yeah, so it is going to create a copy, but don't panic there. That it's perfectly okay if it does that. That's going to be just fine. Okay. So that's state, and that's how state works in React. Now, the other thing that I want to mention here, something that's very closely related to state, is this little thing known as props. So props are all of the, let me do this. Let me do it this way. Okay. So props are values that I can hand into a component. So one of the big things that we built out last week, and this is a core thing inside of React, is we built a component. Components are reusable components. They're reusable building blocks that I can use to create my application. So this component right here is going to display out a list of recipes. Now, the challenge, of course, is right here, you're going to notice this little recipe list. This is only ever going to display that list of recipes, that hard-coded list of recipes. I mentioned components are supposed to be reusable. I have a question for you. How reusable do you think that component is? And the answer, of course, is, well, not very, because that's all that it's going to be able to display. And so what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to pass in a collection of recipes into this and allow it to use it as a parameter, or again, what React would call a prop or property. Now, one of the big rules about props or properties inside of React is that these are always going to be read-only. I'm not going to be able to modify those. That if I want to be able to modify them, then what I'm going to need is I'm going to need that inside of state. And so we'll take a look at that in a couple of minutes here. Question or a couple of things. So RTM says every object created by the React framework automatically gets registered in the DOM, even if it's the same object that you create gets created multiple times. As a result, your DOM tree does expand, and that is true. That your DOM tree will expand, but again, the big thing is going to be those updates that it's able to make and able to do that at a faster rate. Anand says, now that there are functional React components, is there a use case for the class React components? I'm going to openly admit I don't know the answer to that. So let me give a little bit of context. There we go. One of the, yeah, you can actually see it right here. One of the things that React was built on is around class level components. And so what you do is you create a class, you inherit from or extend React component, and then you have that render function, and then that does whatever it is that you want it to then do. It does whatever it is that you want it to render. The React community, and this was introduced relatively recently, is moving more and more towards function-based components rather than class-based components. And to me, and I'll openly admit, I'm not the most experienced React developer, that the whole goal of this show is, hey, let's go in and explore and play. So maybe if somebody else has a better answer, let me know. Or better yet, if you check out Web Wednesday, it's either next week or the week after. I think it's the week after. I'm going to have Aaron Powell on to talk about React and all of that. So we can absolutely ask him that question. I'll admit I don't necessarily know the answer to this. But from my own opinion, I actually started with class-based components. And the reason that I started with class-based components is because of the fact that it was what the docs said. And one of the biggest struggles that I wound up having in working with class-based components is the keyword this. Anybody who's done JavaScript for some length of time knows the challenge that is this. That when I'm working inside of, say, a function, one of the things that I need to bear in mind is that whatever this is can change depending on how that function gets called. And that creates a lot of complexity. And by the way, there was a question earlier about TypeScript. That is one of the things that TypeScript tries to do, is it tries to make it a little bit more consistent in how this works. Yeah, Sashi says this is a menace to use. Absolutely. And on top of that, just to make things even more complex, if I do this or I do this, if I can do my syntax correctly, there we go. This and this are wired up differently. So how you create the function also has an impact on this. So it becomes really convoluted to work with this. And that was actually one of the biggest struggles that I actually wound up running into when I was using class-based components inside of React, is you wind up creating a lot of different helper functions and things like that. And when you get into there, the way that you access different things is by using this. But again, all of that depends. And where it also really wound up being confusing is when I started to get into doing event handlers, that if I was creating whatever the code was that was going to handle the event over here, and the event was going to be raised over here, and I had a couple of different hops, this just wound up getting all levels of convoluted, and you wound up having to create just this really weird bit of syntax to make this work. So because of that fact, function-based components wind up becoming simpler. They wind up becoming more intuitive than using class-based components. So definitely recommend using class-based components. So yeah. Let's see. Okay, yeah. So our team says that the DOM can get polluted, slows down performance. The latest React version that can be resolved by using the fragment version. You wrap the piece of code, and then that gets reused. Visually, this won't impact anything, but your application will reuse components and use less memory. So that's pretty cool. What's the name of the the Wednesday event? Sambo asks. The name is Web Wednesday. And Mallory, I don't know if you're still out there. If you want to throw in a link to Web Wednesday, and in particular to the one that Aaron is going to be joining for, that would be greatly appreciated. RTM says ES6 rocks. It absolutely does, as does TypeScript, but it doesn't always overcome some of those challenges. That unfortunately, some of the challenges that we have with TypeScript are just so embedded in, I'm going to do that sentence all over again. Take two. One of the challenges that we wind up running into with JavaScript is the fact that some of these things are just so embedded into JavaScript that even as far as ES6 wants to take things, or as far as TypeScript wants to take things, that it's still not necessarily able to overcome all of those shortcomings, all of those challenges. So yeah. Todd says from what he understands, the React community is moving towards function-based because it's easier to program and a more conformed way to write React code. Yeah, absolutely. And then Artem adds that React hooks are added in, which is great, and we'll actually hopefully, depending on timing, take a look at React hooks. So yeah, cool. All right. I need to take just a couple of minutes here. There we go. Yeah, I need to take a real quick 2 minutes, and then I'll be back, and then we'll get in and start taking a look at our props here. So I will be back. Okay. Cool. All right. There we go. Yeah, so 2 weeks from now. Yeah, thank you, Mallory. Perfect. Yeah. So I'm going to have Aaron Powell on, who has actually helped me out an awful lot with React. And Aaron is also just great people. So I'm super excited to be talking to him. Todd says, if you're trying to become a professional React developer, it's best to learn both class-based and function-based, because class is still used by some company. And yeah, that's very true. That's very true. And then Artyom says, if you want to work on legacy systems, then yeah. You also have to learn classes in React, and then the fat arrow functions. And yeah, because again, this is a pain. Okay, you know what I'm gonna do real quick? I'm gonna update my OBS. Sometimes you're a fantastic tool, and then sometimes you drive me crazy. Let's start with adding props. Just gonna update my my goals here. There we go. Okay, cool. All righty. Let's see. All right. How do I want to do this? Let me do this. Just trying to decide what I want to do. Okay. Let me do this. I'm going to create a brand new recipe component here. Okay. All right, so I'm going to create a brand new component here. So this component is going to display out a recipe, and let's sort of build this iteratively. Let's just go ahead and go h2, and let's call this mashed potatoes, just because it's a recipe that I could type out off the top of my head. Potato, if I can spell potato correctly there. Okay. There's a spelling bee reference to be made there for people of a certain age, of which I happen to be one. And now what I want to do is I want to update my app temporarily here. I'm going to comment out that recipe list. I'm going to say import recipe from recipe. And then I'm just going to display out my recipe. There we go. Okay, so let me save this and let me go back over here to my page. And now you're going to notice that it's going to just display out mashed potatoes. Okay, now again, it's not going to be the most helpful component, because it will right now display one thing. It will just display mashed potatoes. That's not going to be overly helpful here. So instead, what I want to do is I want to make this dynamic. I want to allow somebody to pass in the name of the recipe. Now, if I'm creating a function this is probably my favorite part here of function-based components. If I'm creating a function and I want to allow somebody to pass in a value, what do I do? And the answer is I add in a parameter. So I can add in a parameter called title. And so now this becomes something that somebody could pass in. Now, what I also really like here about TypeScript, I'm going to go on a little TypeScript aside for just a moment, if you'll indulge me. One of the biggest challenges, actually I shouldn't say one of, this is the biggest challenge that I have with JavaScript, and it's even beyond this, which I know, especially considering how much time we just spent talking about this, is funny, but it's true. The biggest challenge that I have with JavaScript is creating functions. Or more specifically, the biggest challenge that I have with creating functions in JavaScript is typing. Because in JavaScript, there's literally no way for JavaScript to determine what that data type is. What is title? We have no idea. I mean, it's probably a string, but it could be some custom object. It could be, you know, an array. I have no idea what title is. But what I can do with TypeScript is I can say :string, what's known as a type hint. And so now what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, that title there, that's a string. And now look at what I get. I get full IntelliSense here. And so now I can work with that as a string because TypeScript now knows that it's a string. That's fantastic. And what's also great here is remember that as of right now, TypeScript or ES6 doesn't support type hints. So when this is going to be generated, this part right here goes away. So when this is emitted into JavaScript, that goes away. There is no performance hit. There is no bloat or anything like that from adding that in. That's pretty cool. And so now what I can do is I can use my handlebar, my curly brace syntax. I can say title, and now that will be displayed inside of there. And now if I go back over here, what you're going to notice is that it's giving me an error message. It's telling me right here that type empty is not assignable to type string. And you'll also notice just up above, it's giving me the full alias for what this is pointing to. This is one of the biggest things about React, is that when you're creating these custom components here, what you're really doing is you're creating callable functions. So that function will now be called. So to a certain extent, this is also, it's almost just like me saying recipe list, if you will, when I'm using recipe list. So now down here, what I'm trying to do, if it's just like trying to call recipe list, it's just like me trying to say recipe. It's like me just trying to call recipe here. But remember, I can't do that because recipe has a parameter. That parameter is called title. So what I need to do is I need to make sure that I pass in a title here. So just like I would call the function, I would have to say title and then whatever it is that it might be. So in my case, I would need this to be, what am I doing here? I would need this to be mashed potatoes. So now, down here, what I can do is I can now say title equals mashed potatoes. And I realize that I've got one little mistake. Yeah, it's still yelling at me because I need to... There we go. Yeah, there's one little thing that... Oh, for crying out loud. Told you we're really cooking here. Okay. All right, this is going to take me a second to talk through. You know, what was funny was as I was typing it out, I'm like, I know the syntax isn't correct. I know the syntax isn't correct. Trust your gut. Trust your gut. Okay. This is going to take a minute. Let's talk about this. What I did here is I created a brand new interface. And my interface here is called recipe props. And what I'm doing is I'm defining how I want the props for this recipe to look. So I've added in one property there called title of type string. Now, yeah, Artem mentioned, you know, you could go ahead and do it a different way. Yeah, and I could absolutely do that. I could have absolutely done that, but that's not the way that I wanted to do it. You're absolutely right. I could have done it that way. Could have done it that way, but I didn't want to do it that way. I want to do it this way. And again, I'll talk about why. So interfaces are probably my favorite TypeScript feature, because what interfaces allow me to do is they allow me to define what the structure of an object looks like. And more importantly, let me bring up the Typescript Playground here. Yeah, here we go. I've actually already got an interface example up here. That what you're going to notice is it allows me to define how I want an object to look. So I'm defining an object down here, Christopher, and identifying that as a person. And you'll notice that person has one property called name of type string. So if I try to do something like this, where I set it to be 42, it's going to fail. You'll notice it gives me red squigglies. It goes, hey, that needs to be a string. That doesn't work. And so by giving me that ability to define objects, how I want my object structure to look, this opens up just a whole new world of possibilities to me. Because by using this, I can then define how any object is going to look regardless of where it's coming from and regardless of where it's being used. And one of my favorite places to use this is actually when I'm using external APIs. Because how many times have we been here? How many times have you been calling some REST service and not been able to remember what the return object looked like? Well, if I define it in an interface, then I'm done. And what's also great here is notice over here on the right-hand side, that interface is gone. It's weightless. This is my emitted JavaScript. JavaScript doesn't know what an interface is. So when this is compiled, this all goes away. It's fantastic. So now bringing this back over here to my code, what I've now done is I've now said, hey, the properties for this recipe are going to be this. One option right here, that's going to be title, and that's going to be of type string. And so now, and again, that's going to be weightless, that's going to go away. And so now what I do is I get to say, hey, there's my recipe props. There's my parameter type. And all that I want is my title. And this, by the way, is a little ES6 thing. It's my object deconstruction. it will pull out that particular item. So our team highlights that I could have done this, where I could have said something like props and then said props title. And that absolutely works. You can absolutely do that. But by using this bit of syntax here, now I'm deconstructing the object, and now I can just treat those like normal parameters, which is pretty cool. Okay. And by the way, I want to come over here. Yet another really cool little thing here. Look at this. Let's just pause and just reflect in this bit of magic here. Let me just type out a couple of more letters here, just so that way we can trim that list down a little bit. Ignore the red squigglies for a minute here. The red squigglies are there because of the fact that I haven't given it a value yet. Here's what I want you to notice. I'm now getting full IntelliSense here. Without using something like TypeScript, without using this interface, and this is why I wanted to use, oops, let's open up the right item here. That's why I wanted to use this interface here. Without that interface, if I just start typing out title, if I just do this, if I just say props and then props.title, so I don't identify a type, I come back over here, I don't get IntelliSense. Because there's no way for Visual Studio Code to figure out what's available. But, and this is the magic of TypeScript, by my using that interface, now TypeScript goes in and says, oh, all right, I know what's coming here. And so now I get IntelliSense. And so now I go in and now I can say, if I can type correctly, mashed potatoes. And that's pretty cool. And if I highlight over this, you're also going to notice that it's type string. Now, Sasha asks a great question, which is, can you add another param to the interface, like a description to the title? Absolutely. So I could also go in and say like description. And I can make this a string as well. And so now I could come down here and I could say description. And then now I can say div description. There we go. Oh, there we go. Yeah, one of the big things to keep in mind here is that the X stands for XML. And so one of the rules is that everything needs to be contained inside of one root element. And so I just needed section on the outside to make that work. So yeah, so now I've got my section and section here. And so now I've got my title and my description. And now if I come back over here, you're going to notice red squigglies. Because it's going, hey, wait a minute, description is missing. So now I can go in and I can say description equals potatoes that are mashed. I don't know. How do you want me to describe mashed potatoes? Carriers for gravy. Yeah, there you go. Although I have this firmly held belief that if mashed potatoes are made properly, are made with enough seasoning, that they don't need gravy. And don't get me wrong, I love gravy. But if you make mashed potatoes with heavy cream, with butter, and plenty of salt and pepper, you don't need gravy. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, so now I've got my description. And I also want to highlight this. Like, one of the other things that I could do is if I had another interface here. Oh, what would be something? Maybe like cooking instructions. And maybe this was like steps, and I'm going to make this an array of string here. That I can also go in and do this. That I can also say instructions and mark that as cooking instructions. So, and every time that I create an interface, it becomes just like a new type. And so I can go ahead and continue to use that. So it sort of turtles all the way down there, which is pretty cool. Okay. Let's see. Let me, for the time being, let me just make sure that my app is running here. Let's bring up my browser. Chugga, chugga, chugga. Yeah, cool. Yep. So everything is still running. So there's my mashed potatoes. There's my carrier for gravy. So there's my props. There's my props right there. And that's, again, this right here is why I love TypeScript. Actually, I know I did a blog post on this, but about why I like TypeScript, and honestly, it's like it's interfaces. Like this is the primary place is interfaces, and then the secondary is the ability to set parameters on my functions. So yeah. Anon asked the question: advice on getting a software engineering job at Microsoft. So a couple of things. So the first thing that I'm going to mention, and I'm just going to talk to my own experience. Everybody has a different experience in how they land that job at that big company. For me, it was all about networking. So what I did is I worked at a lot of different events. I made a lot of different connections, and then eventually that paid off. That eventually made the right connections. I did a little bit of contract work, and then eventually they made an offer. So that's what worked for me. But again, everybody is different. What I would also say is if you're at a university, if you're at a college that has recruiters, that has a Microsoft Recruiter, definitely reach out to them and definitely try and get an internship. That internships, I think, are one of the best ways to get into Microsoft. So that's my advice. But again, everybody's going to have different bits of advice there. Okay. So now we've got our props there, and let's actually, before I close that one off, let's keep building on this. Let me. Oh, that I'm sorry to hear that. That you had an on-site failed one question, got the other 4 right. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry to hear that. Hopefully you learn from the experience that, one of there's an old saying that you should still go interview like once a year or something like that, just to keep up that skill, because interviewing is a skill. And skills are muscles, and if you don't use them, they atrophy. So eventually it can wind up going away. So hopefully you learn from that experience and keep interviewing. That honestly, I failed at my first 2 attempts to get inside of Microsoft. The first time I didn't wind up getting an interview. The second time I did get an interview, and it did not go real well. The third time was the charm, though. And so here I am. So yeah. Okay. Now let me do do this. So let me create an object here. And I'm going to say title of mashed potatoes, my description of carriers for gravy. Let's make sure that I spelled description correctly. There we go. And that looks good. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say title equals, and I'm going to say title, I'm going to say mashed potato recipe title, and I'm going to say mashed potato recipe description. Okay. And what I'm also going to do, just to sort of prove that I'm updating this, I'm going to say like that. Okay. So there's my title and there's my description. So you'll notice that I'm passing both of those properties in there. And so now, let me come back over here, and you'll notice that that's now been updated. So the big key there that I want you to notice is the fact that I can pass in my objects like that I can go ahead and use that curly brace syntax here as well. So I'm not stuck with just using string literals, that I can pass in more complex items. I think I might also, I'm going to try this. I honestly don't know if this works. I think I can do this though. Yeah, look at that. That works. Boil and mash them, stick them in a stew. Yeah. So you'll notice that that's updated. So let's talk about this. This is cool. So you're going to notice here that what I've done is there's my recipe and there's my curly braces. So if you remember to a minute ago, what I did a minute ago is this, is I had passed in the individual items of title and description. And the way that I was able to do that was by using this curly brace syntax here. So that curly brace syntax is how in React you identify that you want to do something with code. So contrast that with using the single quotes or double quotes, which is going to be a string literal. Curly braces, going to do something with code, going to do something dynamic here. So you'll notice that I'm setting title and I'm setting description. Okay. And if we come back over here, we're going to notice we've got an object right here that's going to be looking for my title and my description. Now, remember that, again, TypeScript is going to convert into JavaScript. So when you're writing TypeScript, you're still writing JavaScript. And this is an important key here. This is an important distinction. Because unlike doing, say, Java, or unlike doing, say, C#, where if I create an interface, the only way for me to use that is if I create a class that implements it, and then I put the appropriate implementation inside of that class. That doesn't exist here. I'm writing JavaScript. This is eventually going to emit JavaScript. JavaScript does not have a concept of interfaces. And so as a result, TypeScript will take literally anything that matches the structure of the interface and call it good. And so you'll notice over here that I didn't set this to be of type recipe props. But I just made sure that I matched it. I have title and I have description. And so because of the fact that I have title and description, that what I can do is I can actually now just pass in that object. And I'm just using the spread operator here. And that will now open it all up, and it will work just fine for me, which is pretty slick. That's cool. All right, or at least it makes me happy. If anybody else is still out there, maybe it's just me. Okay. All right. Let's, there's my recipe. What do I want to do? I've got 20 minutes. Yeah, I think I can do this. Okay. Actually, you know what? I'm going to simplify this a little bit. Okay. Maybe nobody is out there. That's all right. I don't mind talking to myself. Okay. So let's keep on keeping on. So there's my recipe props. I've got my title. I've got my description. I've got my steps now. Let's add that in, and then let's come over here and let's add in some real quick steps. And let's go ahead and do this. Okay, so there's that, and that will now be passed in. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew. Absolutely. It's a that's a very specific reference there to another streamer who does a lot of Civilization 6 stuff. So, but anyway, yeah, if you're looking to do Civ 6, you should definitely go hunt him down. But anyway, okay, back over here. What I'm gonna do is answer the question that came up a second ago. So the question that came up a second ago, sorry, I was trying to get a little bit of code written out here. So the question that came out a second ago is, what's the spread operator? So the spread operator, what this will do is this will deconstruct your object. And so it will automatically break out all of the properties and create a copy of whatever that object is. So there's really actually two main uses for it. Number one is to create a copy. So if I did this, if I said const copy equals mashed potatoes recipe, there we go. That will create a copy of it. That's like the first big thing that you can do with it. The second thing, hey Marlus, the second thing that you can do with it is exactly what I'm doing here. So the line above is equivalent to me doing this. just gonna get rid of my squigglies here. There we go. Format. Okay, much better. I hope that that's okay zoom-wise. Actually, I think I can. There we go. Okay, yeah. So both of those are now equivalent. So there's my recipe and my spread operator. That's the exact same thing as me typing this out below. It's literally the exact same thing. It's obvious, though, that line 23, that terser syntax, is going to be a bit easier for me to maintain. So, yeah. Okay. Sasha asked the question, mashed potato recipe become a JavaScript object? It did. Yep. I created that up here. Right up there. Cool, cool, cool. Okay. That is that. I think I'm looking good. Let me make sure that my app is looking good. It is. Yep. There we go. Cut, boil, mash. Perfect. Okay. Looking good, looking good. Yeah, absolutely. Questions are always welcome here. Questions are always welcome here. Okay. And if you're curious about this, this is just me converting, oops, get out of here. This is just me converting my list of steps into an ordered list. All right. Now, what I want to do is I want to incorporate that into state. So, whoa, I want hooks, introducing hooks. Okay, so hooks are a new concept inside of React, introduced with React 16.8. And what hooks allow us to do is they allow us to manage one of the biggest rules about React, which is that state is not allowed to change. You're not allowed to change your state values directly. What you always need to do is you always need to replace the existing object with a new one. Now, the way that that is going to be managed through a hook is by, using this little thing called useState. What useState will do is it will register an object inside of React as a stateful object. And it will give me back two items. It will give me back a reference to that object, and it will give me back a function that I can use whenever I want to update that value. So this will give me the object. This is what I will use when I want to update it. And so useState, I set this to the initial value. So let's go ahead and let's start by moving mashed potatoes, or our mashed potatoes recipe, into a state object. That's going to be the easiest way for me to do this. By the way, one other really cool thing about TypeScript, eventually I'll stop gushing about TypeScript. But until then, another great thing about TypeScript is, is the fact that, I thought that was going to give me a drop down and it didn't, is the fact that it will detect anything that's going to be available to me and automatically add in my import statements for me. So if I say use state here and I come back up, you'll now notice that that's now added in as one of my import statements. That's pretty slick. Okay, so say use state and then my mashed potatoes recipe like that. And then let's update this to now just use the recipe. Okay, so this recipe here, this is now my stateful recipe. Okay. I'm building this on the fly here. Like I really am, we're really coding here. And so I'm like literally just trying to think through, okay, what do I now want to do to like set up an event handler and some other things here. What actually is useState in terms of React? Is a library or a package of functions? It's a helper function. So useState gives me access to there we go. useState gives me access to a hook, and what hooks allow me to do in React is they allow me to gain some level of access to what's going on behind the scenes inside of React, or to give me the opportunity to let React know that something has changed. So remember again, the biggest challenge that we have here is we're not able to modify state directly. That again, the only way that we can update state is by replacing it with a brand new object. And what React is going to do is it's going to look for when that was replaced, and then it will go ahead and make all of the appropriate updates to the UX, and then also optionally give me the ability to execute my own code in response to those things changing. Now, because of the fact that React wants some level of control over that object, which makes sense because after all, React needs to know when that's been replaced. React needs to know when something has happened to it. The way that I need to register that is going to be through that useState function. So that's basically this little useState right here to use their example. This is me now telling React, hey, I'm going to create a brand new state object. And in their example, they're using the number 0. In my example, I'm using this mashed potatoes object. So I now want to take that and I now want to register that as part of React's state. So the first thing that useState will then give back to me is the copy of the object as it's referenced in state. So that's the first thing that it's going to give back to me. The next thing that it's going to give back to me is a function that I can then use whenever I want to update it. So I'm not allowed to say recipe dot and then set something. I'm not allowed to do that because recipe is going to be read only here. So I'm not allowed to update that directly. Instead, what I need to do is I need to use set recipe. whenever I want to update that. And again, it's going to be that I give it back a brand new copy of a recipe object that it can then use to update. So that's what's going on with useState. Okay. Absolutely, you're welcome. Okay, let me just update the title here, Stateful Mashed Potatoes. And I want to highlight the fact that you'll notice down below here that I'm using that stateful object here. So yoink, there you go. So those two right there are what's being wired up. And so if I now come back over here and I now open up my recipe manager, you'll notice that it's now showing me stateful mashed potatoes. And then there is that. Okay. Now, unfortunately, we are at time. I was afraid that I had given myself a bit too much to try and get through, and I have. So what I want to do is I at least want to commit all of this and push all of this out. So let me do that real quick here. And while I'm doing that, are there any questions? I know that we didn't get into set recipe here to actually update the state, and I will get into that next week. This is not just me trying to tease and get everybody to come back next week, although it works out pretty well for that. But let me go ahead and at least commit this. So I'm going to say git add dot git commit m updated to use state, and then we'll say git push. Okay. And while that's being pushed out, it's also kind of a nice opportunity for me to go into my actions here. And because of the fact that this is using Azure Static Web Apps, it's actually now deploying out to my Azure Static Web Apps site as well, which is pretty slick. Okay, cool. So any questions on anything that we've seen up until this point here that we did add props, so I can put a check next to that. We added state at least. Even if we didn't necessarily do a whole lot with it, but we did add state. We are deploying our updates now. There we go. And then we debugged. Cool. Yeah. So we met most of our goals. We just missed the events part, which we'll come back to next week. So this is Code and Coffee. So what we did today is we went through our bundler, talked about the need for bundlers and how Snowpack works, and the importance of using the tool the way that it's meant to be used. So important. Then what we did is we went in and created a brand new component. And we added properties to that component inside of React, which is great because that allows me to then pass values in. And we explored a lot of different ways that we could pass that in. We took a look at how we can use interfaces in TypeScript to give us a lot of power over how we're going to define the data that's going to get passed in. And then we took a little bit of a look at hooks and state inside of React. Next week, what I want to do is I want to keep building on that I want to add in the full state where we're now going to allow changes there. And I also want to start to incorporate some level of a back end here that right now everything is just hard coded on the client. So I'd like to start to incorporate something on the back end as well there. So that is a wrap for today. I do apologize that we didn't get everything done, but there's always next week. And that's sort of it. That we'll continue to build this over the weeks. And this format just it gives a lot of freedom to go explore different things, and it gives a lot of freedom to dig into things that we wouldn't necessarily have time for. So hopefully you enjoyed it. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. And I will see everybody next week, 9 a.m. Pacific time for Code and Coffee. Thanks for tuning in.